Hello, this is Brian Madden inviting you to come aboard as we open up our chest of stories from On the River, seen every Sunday night here on WTZA at 6:30. The years between 1936 and 1941 are ones that Roger Mabie will long remember, for that was a time he used to glide up and down the Hudson River on the grand old steamboats. Roger is a former president of the Historical Steamship Society of America.
It was an interesting era, and of course the highlight of the steamboat era occurred, before the railroads came along. I mean, prior to the advent of the railroads up both sides of the Hudson, which was, on the east shore, the Hudson River Railroad, which later became the New York Central, inched its way northward around in the 1850s. On this side of the river, the West Shore Railroad didn't come up until about 20 years after that. But the steamboats were a vital link, because at the time when they were at their peak, the man could only move as fast as a horse could pull him or carry him, or before the steamboats appeared on the scene, you had to rely on wind with the sloops and the schooners. So when the steamboat appeared, and the first one did, of course, here on the Hudson River, it was a quantum leap forward as far as, of course, speed is a relative thing, but you had to depend on, the wind and the tide to move a vessel. A steamboat, of course, cut the time tremendously. Or a sloop or a schooner, of course, if they had following wind and a small gale blowing, could probably make it from Albany to New York in anywhere from 24 to 36 hours. But normally it would take anywhere from 3 days to a week. So when the steamboat came on the scene and cut the time in a matter of years to, say, 9 hours, that was an enormous big advantage. And at that point, of course, everybody, the passengers, the freight, the mail, all moved by steamboat. And then, of course, when the Erie Canal opened in the mid-1820s, the Hudson River and the Mohawk Valley became one of the major ways for the immigrants to move westward into the Great Lakes and the Midwest. So the Hudson, of course, was a major transportation artery, and the steamboats it was a colorful era.
During Roger's college years, he held a summer position with the old Hudson River Dayline. He says one of the most exciting experiences was when he used to go aboard the foreign vessels.
When I worked on the Dayline, the transatlantic liner was still in its heyday. It was before the airplane had appeared on the scene to take all the passengers away, so everybody going between Europe and this country did so by ocean liner, and most of them came into New York. And it was that period when the really big liners, the Normandy, the Queen Mary, came into New York on their maiden voyages, and it was always a thrill to see those ships for the first time. And when we worked on the Dayline, we would frequently go aboard those vessels, and just to see what they looked like. And it was really extremely interesting, because every ship was a little slice of life of the country from where it was going, from which it came. I mean, the German ships, for example, were obviously different from the French ships, and the French were different from the British, and all the little things. I mean, the crew, of course, in the French ships all spoke French naturally. And up on the promenade deck, the signs would be both in English and in French.
When the old Dayline ceased operating in 1948, an alumni association was formed. And one of the things the members would do was take weekend sailing excursions along the river.
After the old Dayline stopped, and of course they reduced the number of boats that they had, some of the pilots then became pilots of the freighters and the tankers that go up the Hudson. These big, large ocean-going ships have to have a pilot to take the vessel up the river. And some of these old dayline pilots became what they call Hudson River pilots to take the freighters and the tankers up the Hudson. And after one of these so-called dayline reunion sails, the pilot who was on one of the boats that I was on, Hendrick Hudson, who was then a Hudson River pilot, asked me, he knew I lived somewhere along the river, he wasn't quite sure, so he asked me for a couple of landmarks. I mentioned a couple, and he said, oh, I know where that is. So I said, next time you're in the area, or sometime you're in the area, stop in for dinner. So about a week later, he was bringing a Greek tanker up the Hudson. He got off our place right out here, he dropped the anchor and came in and had dinner. And after dinner, went back to the tanker.
The Historical Steamship Society of America was formed 50 years ago. It has over 3,500 members worldwide, and Roger Mabie says the group has a lot to offer.
The thing that attracts, admittedly, most of the members to it is a quarterly journal or magazine that the Society publishes called Steamboat Bill. Now, in addition, the Society also has a publications program. It publishes books on the subject from time to time. And it also has its own library, which is, well, it's based at the University of Baltimore. And the library is a source of, well, it's a resource source for people that are writing books about, well, the Titanic, for example. Or it's also an excellent source of photographs, and a lot of the newspapers that are writing stories about steamships, steamboats, will use the photo library of the Society as a source of photographs. They have, oh, I don't know, something like 40,000 negatives, an enormous number.
Over the years, Roger has collected memorabilia dating back to the time of the steamboats. His first is an exhibit of lithographs, and he says they are irreplaceable.
These three steamboats were all built right after the Civil War. And these two, the Drew and the St. John, St. John, incidentally, is not named after the biblical St. John, but after a man by the name of A.P. St. John. Both A.P. St. John and Daniel Drew were two of the steamboat operators of that era, and they were officers of the night line that ran between Albany and New York. And modesty was certainly not one of their virtues. They not only named the steamboats after them, but in the legend here, if you can read it, it says the grandest palace drawing room steamers in the world, which is rather an all-inclusive statement. But the railroad reached Albany in 1852, and prior to that, the steamboat operators were very apprehensive that once the railroad got to Albany, that their business would collapse. But it didn't, and the steamboats were able to operate and to compete very successfully against the railroads. As a matter of fact, railroads initially were built as feeders for the steamboat companies. In other words, the railroad lines would converge on the points from which the ports from which the steamboats would leave. And down here, for example, it says, it gives the schedule, and it says leaving Albany daily on arrival of the trains. And then it says about the connections they make. But right after the Civil War, particularly the Albany line, built very large steamboats, and they were outfitted very luxuriously. As a matter of fact, they were more luxurious than probably anything ashore. And their ornate interiors was a great attraction at that time to the traveling public. These boats actually traveled at night. They would leave, in this case, one steamer would leave Albany, one would leave New York. And so this lithograph is sort of artistic license, since obviously it shows them passing in the Hudson River in broad daylight, something that actually they never did. And actually they used to pass right north of Kingston. And the Dean Richmond was named after the president of the New York Central Railroad at that time, which was at that point was considered not a competitor so much as a a feeder or a supplier of freight and passengers for the steamboats. And this trio of steamboats actually, well, particularly the Drew and the St. John, continued to run on the river up until the early years of the 20th century. The St. John was destroyed by fire while laid up, or not laid up, but tied up at her pier in New York City. But every one of these steamboats has a sort of a story to tell. And matter of fact, the old New York Herald Tribune at one time in an editorial mentioned that steamboats and steamships, probably more than any other inanimate object, have friends. And that is certainly true.
Each lithograph is filled with history from the great steamboat days.
This actually started out to be a watercolor by an artist by the name of James Bard. James Bard is well, his specialty was the painting of steamboats, and almost invariably every one of them would be a port or left-hand side view of the vessel. There were certain distinguishing characteristics. It was almost a primitive type of painting, but today his paintings are bringing enormous prices. When he was doing these, they were done mostly for either the owners, the captains, or the chief engineers of the vessels, and he would do a watercolor for $25, an oil painting for $35. As a matter of fact, there are 4 of his paintings in the Senate House Museum in uptown Kingston. And this one of the city of Catskill, which also was the company that owned it, were sort of a little exuberant here. And since the city of Catskill was always been a village, it's still a village. But at that time, I guess the city fathers thought they were going to perhaps grow. And anyway, a steamboat was named the City of Catskill, which was built in 1880. And in 1882, there was a large overnight night boat from Kingston called the Thomas Cornell. Was lost. It ran up on Danskammer Point in a fog about 4 miles north of Newburgh, and the vessel was a total loss. The company immediately ordered a replacement vessel to be built, but of course it would take a year or 2 for the vessel to be built. In the meantime, they chartered this vessel, the City of Catskill, from the Catskill Line to run in place of the Thomas Cornell, which it did during the year of 1882. And then during the winter, it was laid up in Rundout Creek behind the Cornell Steamboat Company office. And the Cornell office happened to catch fire. The building was destroyed. The fire spread to the steamboat, and the steamboat was frozen in the ice and couldn't be moved. The steamboat was destroyed, and because of that, or at least I think it was because of that, is that this, what started out to be a watercolor, was never finished. This one below here, the Alida, or some pronounce it Alida, is actually a reproduction of a Bard watercolor. But this is an original here, although it's an unfinished original.
As a part of his collection, Roger has car cards, which were a form of advertising.
The steamboat companies, particularly the Hudson River Day Line, since they had the most steamboats and carried the most people, did a lot of advertising. They would advertise on the subway stations, the elevated stations, the trolley cars. And these car cards were overhead. And even today in the subway cars, they still have this type of advertising. And of course, obviously, in the case of the Day Line, they extolled the glories of the Hudson, and they talked about the Hudson being America's best river trip, and then autumn outings on the Hudson. In those days, the company would operate up until right after Columbus Day, and in some years they even operated until Election Day. And here's one talking about rare June days on the Hudson, and another one about the Hudson is glorious now, talking about the fall foliage. And here's another talking about taking a trip to Poughkeepsie and to visit Vassar College, picture of the railroad bridge going across the river. And this was of the Central Hudson Line, which operated out of Kingston. But like all of the companies, New York was the big originator of traffic. And every weekend, particularly on Sundays, they would have special trips, in this case to Newburgh. And here's one of the old Hudson River night line. And since the night line operated at night, this is obviously a night scene in New York Harbor, and the old night line made a great to-do about called themselves the searchlight route. And here's a searchlight, of course, illuminating the steamboat.
As we mentioned before, Roger worked aboard a steamboat. He used to sail on the Hendrick Hudson, one of the largest of the dayliners. It had a crew of 102 and was able to hold over 5,000 passengers.
I was one of about a dozen or so so-called college boys who worked on her during the summer. And we were known as cadets. Wherever there was any money handled, there would be one of these so-called cadets. They included the cashier in the dining room, the cashier and the manager and the checkers down in the cafeteria, manager of the candy stand, manager of the newsstand, manager of the soda fountain, manager of the check room, and the purser's assistants. And of course, one of those was also always a pre-med student, because on a vessel such as this with a lot of people on, there was always somebody who would slip or pinch their finger, or one reason or another would require some little medical attention. So each boat had a pre-med student on board, but it was a great way to spend a summer.
Another of Roger's collections is of original sketches of steamboats by Samuel Ward Stanton, who was a famous marine artist born in Newburgh.
Hudson River Dayline, up on the second deck of their steamers, always had a series of paintings. And Stanton, with his great interest in steamboats, did the murals on the steamer Robert Fulton, and there were 6 there that depicted the development of steam navigation on the Hudson. And in 1913, the Hudson River Dayline was planning to build a new vessel called the Washington Irving. And Irving had spent a part of his life at the Alhambra over in Spain, and Stanton went to Spain in 1912 to get some on-site sketches. And with his great interest in ships in the sea, he decided to return back to this country on the maiden voyage of the Titanic. Stanton lost his life on the Titanic, and of course, obviously, all the sketches that he had gathered while in Spain also were lost. But previously, in 1895, he had a book had been published called American Steam Vessels, which was a collection of some 400 or more sketches that Stanton had made of American steam vessels, both river, sound, and ocean vessels, and also some naval vessels, right from the first North River steamboat of Robert Fulton up through the last vessel that was built at the time the book was published. But I have here a number of the original sketches, like this one, for example, is the original sketch of the one that appears here. This is the original sketch of that page. And this one of the Homer Ramsdell's, the Hudson River steamer, is also in this book. These sketches I happened to obtain from Stanton, one of Stanton's daughters, who now in her 80s is living in Jamestown, Rhode Island. She was she's the widow of a former Navy officer, an admiral, and but she had a great number of these original sketches that her father had done, and I was fortunate in being able to acquire some of them.
Roger Mabie, a man who was brought up along the river in Port Ewan, who also worked and played on the river all his life. He believes that even though the era of the grand steamboats is gone, the future of the Hudson River itself is something again.
I think there's no question the river is, as I mentioned before, is getting cleaner. It's being used by more and more people, and I think they're all very positive things. And I think the people locally and the state, through the State Department of Environmental Conservation, all realize, at least today, how important the river is to the communities that border it. And I'm very optimistic about the future of the river.
Thanks for joining us for a look into our chest of stories on the river. And remember, each Sunday night, more of the same right here at 6:30, WTZA TV on the river.